The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. Tonight's guest is Assemblyman Louis Sepulveda of the 87th Assembly District in the Bronx. He and his colleagues are back from Albany after a difficult legislative session that concluded with some finished and some unfinished business. As part of our ongoing mission to keep the people of the Bronx in close touch with their elected representatives, tonight we will review with the Assemblyman the state's actions on rent regulations or inactions, depending on how you look at it, mayoral control of schools, the status of the 421A tax abatement, criminal justice reforms, and a variety of other subjects. The phones are open tonight, so you can join us by calling 718-960-7621. You can also submit questions or comments to us at bronxtalk@bronxnet.org or on the Bronx Talk Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. For the here and now, we counted, he's making his 13th appearance since his first one in 1997, which was before he was an elected official, as a matter of fact, from the 87th AD, which includes the Bronx neighborhoods of Castle Hill, West Farms, Parkchester, East Tremont, and Van Nest. Assemblyman Louis Sepulveda, welcome back. Nice to see you.
I can tell you that back in 1997, I had a lot more hair than I do today.
I probably did too, and folks can go look at our archives. I'm sure they could find out for sure. Lots to talk about. Let's just step back and say, okay, so I'm a resident of the Bronx. I've been following what's going on in Albany. I'd like to see some direction. I'd like to see the legislature and the governor get together and tell us what we're doing. I may agree or disagree, but I feel like we basically got like, well, we'll punt some things to the future. Some of the issues, immigration reform, that DREAM Act, those kinds of things, minimum wage, we didn't quite get to those. So I feel like as a person of the general public, I didn't quite get my money's worth in this session. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I mean, the problem is, Ari, is that we have to analyze the political realities of what happens, especially up in Albany. We have an assembly that's controlled by Democrats, and you have a Senate that's controlled by Republicans, and the Republican agenda is a lot more different than the Democrat and the Assembly's agenda. So we can propose wonderful legislation, we can propose rent regulations that protect more tenants, but we can't get it out of the Assembly. And so without cooperation, we can't get it out of the Senate, and without cooperation from the Republicans in the Senate, then you have to negotiate. And sometimes you can't get everything that you want and exactly what you want, and you have to settle for a little less. And that's essentially what's happened during this legislative session.
Are you satisfied that there was proper negotiation and compromise on issues?
Well,
we're going to break them down, folks, and
sure.
He knows that.
Yeah. Am I satisfied with the final product? If you look at it from a point of view of having to compromise, if you look at the point of view of what you would have gotten had you not compromised, then you have to say that I am satisfied. Mm-hmm. Am I satisfied with the end product? No, I wish we could have gotten more, especially on rent regulations. However, if we stand on ceremony, if we hold our ground, then we may have gotten anything. And so, it was a difficult legislative period. We had a changing of two leaders, one in the Senate and one in the Assembly. So when you had all this coupled with everybody's agenda, it makes it difficult sometimes to get exactly what you want.
Pundits, in fact, I read a very impassioned piece just today, said, well, you know what, if you do the simple math, you got the governor who's a Democrat, you say the Assembly is Democratic controlled, the Senate is Republican controlled, sounds to me like 2-1. Mm-hmm. But they criticized the governor and said, you know what, he made more friends and did more for the Republican Senate than he did for Assembly Democrats or for Democratic initiatives.
Well, look, the governor's a Democrat. And sometimes what he does in Albany is baffling to us, especially my colleagues in the Assembly. Sometimes we don't believe that he fights hard for some positions that are important to us. For example, the DREAM Act. I believe that if the governor had put the full court press that he put for lack of a better term, the Education Investment Tax Credit Act, if he had put that kind of effort into the DREAM Act, we would have had a DREAM Act today.
That would be one. I'm assuming a minimum wage bill could be on that same page?
That's probably along the same lines. So, I mean, sometimes the reality is that when Carl Hastie, the Speaker, Flanagan and Cuomo were in the room, that the only Democrat in that room was Carl Hastie.
Which is almost like a double vote for the Bronx, because unlike in the past, we have somebody from the Bronx representing us literally in that 3 men in the room. Yes. One more question before we get to some of the specifics. A writer in the Times said that this was an anti-urban agenda. Ultimately, that was what was passed, and he or she actually said it was fueled by the mayor and governor's personal differences, and that the Senate Republicans wanted to get back at the mayor for supporting their opponents in the elections, which is kind of an interesting thing, that people support anybody and he's being punished for just stepping out. But nonetheless, did that play? Is that a factor? Is that there was kind of an anti-de Blasio, anti-urban agenda in that way?
Well, I mean, look, obviously the Republicans in the Senate weren't happy with any effort by the mayor or anybody in the city to try to change the structure and the leadership in the Senate. But the reality is that the Senate Republicans have had an anti-urban agenda for many years. At least I've been in Albany now for 3 legislative sessions, and some of their positions are baffling because they don't make sense. So to say that it's all attributed to the mayor's effort to bring more Democrats to the Senate, I think is unfair.
Let's get to it. Rent regulations extended for 4 years. Many felt that it cut tenants short, that a real reform bill would have been preferable. What's your thought? Evaluate where we're at now with rent regs. And in fact, you and I had a little interaction before the show. They're having the Rent Stabilization Board is having their session tonight, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't have an answer for it. It could be a matter of moments, but we're a touch early on that. Nonetheless, what do you think?
Again, we have to look at the positions that we have vis-a-vis the Republicans in the Senate, the Democrats in the Assembly. We can fight to push our one house bill was a lot stronger in terms of rent protections and rent guidelines. However, that bill was not going to get out of the Senate, so we wouldn't have gotten anything. What we got now, I believe, is the best that we can get under current political conditions. We're hopeful that with the presidential primaries coming up, with Hillary possibly being at the top of the ticket, that the voter turnout will increase and we'll be able to take back some of those Republican seats in the Senate to the point where we'll have a Democratic majority again. Then we can push more of this agenda. But right now it was unrealistic under the current political climate that we have in Albany, with the Republicans blocking any effort at strong rent regulations.
What would you like to see and present it in a way, if you will, that would... I mean, we know that you wanted 8 years and all this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. What would you have liked to see, and what is realistic for people who rent right now to think, gee, okay, we're going to stomach this one for a little while? What would be your goal ultimately that is a realistic outcome for rent regulations?
Well, I would like to increase the threshold for vacancy decontrol. Currently it's $2,500. Under the legislation we just passed, it will increase to $2,700. In some places where rents are higher and you have indexing, it'll be actually a little bit higher. So we had to, the most we can extract from the Republicans at this point was $2,700 in terms of vacancy decontrol. I believe that once the Democrats take control of the Senate, that we can certainly rework those numbers to a point where it reaches about $3,500 for decontrol to take effect.
As long as, I mean, the implication of what you're saying is, I guess, significant. In other words, as long as the Republicans control the Senate, there's no other compromise, there's no other way of getting anything done in as far as rent regulation. What is said that we would lose, I mean, the advocates are saying we'll lose 100,000 rent-controlled apartments during the next 4 years. That's not insignificant. I don't want to count up what percentage in the Bronx, but that would be significant.
Well, I mean, look, we've been losing units to decontrol for several years now, but you know, there's not much you can do. You can try to stem the tide and hope that in a couple of years when we have another election that the Democrats will take control of the Senate. Look, we got some good things in this bill. There's the premise of landlord harassment of tenants. They harass tenants to the point where they leave the unit, and therefore the landlord could increase rents. For harassment, first-time offense, the landlord will be charged $1,000. If the harassment was so severe that a tenant had to vacate the premises, the landlord could hit with an $11,000 fine. So it's pretty significant. Also,
which is really the first time that we've had
first time ever. That's correct.
Anything of significance. And will there be enough oversight to make sure that those things really happen?
Well, that's that's a part of what's built into the package, and also with major capital improvements. Now, the period for a landlord to recover any monies for major capital improvement has been extended depending on the number of units in a building. It can go from 84 months to 106 months. If it's a larger building, the numbers are greater. That's also a significant victory for advocates for rent regulations, and we shouldn't overlook that. Major capital improvement is a major problem in many of the rent-regulated apartments. So to extend the period now eases the burden on the renter to pay that MCI increase.
Let's talk about this 421A tax abatements. I think that it's a very interesting concept, because if you talk to people in the Bronx, they will tell you, well, we don't want developers to get tax abatements. We've been down that road and it hasn't benefited us. Mm-hmm. But the idea here, for folks who may or may not know, the idea here would be a trade-off. In other words, you can get the tax abatements, but you've got to turn back. The number that was thrown around was at least 25 to 30% affordable housing. Where are we at right now? I mean, this was, again, extended but not altered. We never really got a clear vision of what direction the state ought to go through this process. Let's
consider what the purpose of 421A was, right? We were having problems developing apartments in the city of New York in the 1970s. The legislation was passed to provide incentives to landlords to build apartments in the city with requirements for affordable housing. What we got was ultimately that there was an issue between the trades unions and the developers. They wanted to have the living wage built into the extended 421A program. The problem with that was that it would be less cost in terms of viability. It would be more expensive. And so the developers were saying that they couldn't develop with the prevailing wage provision as part of the legislation. So at the end of the day, what we said was, let's put these two entities in a room, and within 6 months, if they can come up with a reasonable wage to do the development, then we'll extend 421A for 4 years. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that the mayor has taken shots. Actually, the mayor has been criticized for several aspects of what's happened recently. But for 421A and what we got ultimately, and possibly what we can get, we should be very thankful to the mayor, because under his plan, the amount of affordable housing units that's being required now under the legislation will probably increase within 10 years from 12,000 to about 25,000. Mm-hmm. And the threshold number for affordable housing will go from 46,000 to 31,000. Had the mayor not taken the position that he took, we wouldn't have those favorable numbers. So, the city, if in fact the 421A is successful, the bargaining between the trade unions and the developers is successful in 6 months and it's extended, the city of New York owes a debt of gratitude for those who are in need of affordable housing, because I think he's done a great job with that component.
Mm-hmm. Not to minimize your enthusiasm, you have been a supporter of Mayor de Blasio since the beginning.
Right, but I've also been critical when I've had to be, sure.
Probably on this show.
Yeah.
Mark from Pelham Parkway is joining us. We haven't heard from Mark in a long time, as a matter of fact. Hi, Mark.
Hello.
What's up?
Hey, Gary.
How are you, sir?
Oh, wow. I forget you're on a time delay here.
Well, just talk. What do you got?
I've got a couple of questions, just a couple of questions. It seems like every year it's the same thing. Legislation, they have 6 months of legislation. I think they go out and play ping pong, and then all of a sudden the last 2 weeks before the end, we got to start doing this. Does anybody ever plan, if businesses ran their businesses the way the Senate and the Assembly runs their business, everybody would be out of business.
So let me ask the Assemblyman this question. This is stay with us, Mark. This is in essence what I was alleging in the beginning, that the general public could say, well, wait a minute, what's getting done? Is there enough thought put into this And ultimately, is it all really a waste because it comes down to those three men in a room?
You know, to say that we're playing ping pong for 6 months,
I don't
it's a
think
bit
the
trivial.
Assemblyman is doing that.
But however, we spend 6 months up there. We have a vast agenda. The governor usually opens up the State of the State with his agenda, and the Assembly has their agendas. Now, you know, we have so many regional interests, even in the Assembly. We have, you know, the northern districts that have different interests than the city of New York, than Yonkers. So when you're talking about 150 different interests in a room in the Assembly and 63 different interests in the Senate and the governor's agenda, you have to mesh all of that. It's very difficult. And then we have to participate in the art of compromise. You know, Yonkers has different desires and interests than the city of New York. It's very complicated.
Are you satisfied with this current three men in a room? Could that work in maybe some circumstance? I don't know where, but...
I don't, Gary. The one thing I'd like to interject here right now is that I think three men in a room is way outdated. There was supposed to be transparency, and the only transparency I see is you change the leaders, people get indicted, you got new leaders in there, so it's amateur night in Bucharest, and you're right back to the same thing again.
So
Three men
did you
in
have
a
a
room,
second question,
no
Mark?
transparency.
Or was that essentially it, was the three men in a room thing?
Well, let me answer the transparency, Mark, especially under the current new speaker. We've had more transparency now than we've ever had in the past. You know, some of the transparency requirements, some of the reporting requirements that we have as legislators, some of the ethical requirements that we have as legislators are greater now than ever before. So for you to say that, you know, there's no transparency is grossly inaccurate.
Okay.
I don't think
anything
so. I'd
real
argue,
quick, Mark?
I would argue
anything
that
else?
one point, only because if you look, the head of the Assembly is under indictment. The head of the
Currently?
Senate's under
I don't know.
indictment.
Oh, you mean the previous?
mean the previous.
Previous head, yes.
Well, I'm speaking under the new
All right,
speaker.
Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's talk about mayoral control of schools. Now, whether you want it or you like it or don't like it, it certainly seems like, goodness gracious, make a decision to punt it for next year to go through this dialogue again. And it'll be election year, so many of you will certainly be distracted. Some will have bigger races than others. Where are we at with mayoral control, and was this really kind of a bad moment?
Well, look, the reality is that when Bloomberg, who was a Republican, went to the Senate for mayoral control, they had no problem extending it for 7 years, whatever terms they extended it. Now that you have de Blasio, who, again, many of the Senate Republicans were upset about because whatever efforts he's allegedly made to make the Senate more democratic, they dug their heels in the sand and refused to extend it beyond the year. And so, you know, it's unfortunate that the average person doesn't see what happens in terms of politics.
Well, that's why you're on the TV show tonight.
Yeah, so when you hear comments like Mark's comments that trivialize and essentially poke fun at what we do, it makes it difficult for people to understand what really happens in Albany. And so we should have extended mayoral control. We have to have a person responsible for the educational policy for the city of New York. I think the mayor, again, he's a friend, and I applaud what he's done. Look what he's done with universal pre-K. Look at a lot of the efforts that he's done to educate and reform education in the city. He should have gotten mayoral control for a long period of time.
Excuse me. Sorry. Let's talk about criminal justice reform. And you were one of the Assembly members and one of the legislators who stood up, and you called for raising the age of criminal responsibility, grand jury disclosure, increasing access to mental health services, and those kinds of things. Are you satisfied?
Oh, that's one area where I'm very dissatisfied. The most we can extract was a promise by the governor. We couldn't do it legislatively because, again, the Republicans were not budging an inch on this issue of criminal justice reform and raise the age. The most we can get was the governor to indicate that he will no longer put 16 and 17-year-olds together in adult prisons. He will separate them. But you know, look at the scary numbers.
Why was this such a flashpoint issue then? One would think that the governor and Governor Cuomo, given his vast experience in many aspects of public life, could say, well, let's really reform the system. Why wouldn't he get behind it and want to do that?
Well, I mean, initially with his budget proposal and his legislative proposal, he did get behind it. He offered a very robust, comprehensive criminal justice package, a fair raise the age concept. We had to tweak some of it. But the Republicans all they were interested in was discussing about building more prisons. You know, I myself spoke to many Republicans in passionate speeches about, if you want to look at the cost savings that are involved when you provide diversionary programs, when you separate 16-year-olds, when you give them an opportunity not to have a record so that they can then go to college and not have a scarlet letter when it prevents them from getting good jobs. They can go to college, become productive members of society. You know, when they have criminal records, it makes it more difficult. I spoke to them. Again, one more thing is that these 16, 17-year-olds, a lot of them are suffering from mental illness. Over 40% of them are. When I spoke with my colleagues in the Senate about this issue, fell on deaf ears. When I talked to them about the cost analysis, the savings, the immense savings that other states like Texas, who've engaged in Raise the Age and in criminal justice reform, the savings that are involved, billions and billions of dollars, they don't seem to care.
Are upstate Republicans in that dialogue concerned because many of their small towns literally live off the prison system as it is, and any adjustment of the prison system is potentially going to shrink it down and cost jobs and those kinds of things? You know, as well-meaning, and you and some of your colleagues here in the Bronx are, we've had this dialogue all the time.
You know, I would like to think that is part of the only part of their agenda, the only part that they're concerned about. But I think it goes beyond that. I think a lot of it is that we have an inherent racial bias in the criminal justice system in this state and in this country. Like, you have 2.3 million prisoners in the United States. Over nearly 1 million of those are African American and Latino young men and women. Where you would have these Republicans immediately go for criminal justice reform is if the following happened. When Governor Cuomo opened the State of the State, he talked about the epidemic of heroin now in the state of New York.
We certainly have it here in the Bronx.
Well,
we did a full show on that.
It was characterized as an epidemic when it was hit in the suburbs, okay? When it started hitting white neighborhoods. Now, I don't wish ill on anyone, but I think that these Republicans and many others who are against any sort of criminal justice reform would be more willing to do it if, of the 2.3 million prisoners that were going to prison, that most of them are young white men.
Coming out of their neighborhoods.
That's correct. That's correct. That's when you'll have a movement from that segment of society to alter the criminal justice system in this country.
It's not really a state issue. I'm just curious because it's involved in this dialogue. Did you like what Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito was proposing to decriminalize low-level crimes?
Oh, absolutely. Look, a lot of these kids, you know, putting their foot on a subway seat, very low levels of marijuana, urinating in a public place. A lot of people will spend 3, 4, 5, 6 days in prison. Some of them will lose their jobs, and a lot of them can't get out of prison on low-level, non-violent offenses because they can't afford bail. So they go and they'll spend time in Rikers. They'll be exposed to what happens in Rikers. Many of them wait prolonged periods of time before they even can go to trial. And a lot of it is because they can't pay $1,000, $500 of bail. It's an unfair system. You know that in Texas, they no longer incarcerate young men for non-violent misdemeanors. They don't go through the system. They go through a different system. They're given diversionary programs. And we're talking about Texas. We're not talking about New York, which is supposed to be the most progressive state in the country.
Do you like the idea that Mayor de Blasio flip-flopped on the hiring of more cops? I mean, he had said that we're not going to do it and it's too expensive and it's off the table. And the next thing you know, we now have 1,300 new police officers.
Well, you know, Mayor de Blasio has to deal with the city council who was pushing for this. Am I comfortable with it? I'm not 100% comfortable with it. Absolutely not. I think that, you know, you look at the crime numbers. People are talking about how we're going back to the days where you had the OK Corral in the city, and this is nonsense. When we cut the number of stop and frisk in the city of New York by 90%, people thought we were going to have Armageddon in this country. The reality is that by 2014, by the end of 2014, we had the lowest levels of crimes in the city of New York, 333. So why there's a need for more police officers is a little confusing to many of us.
Well, you know, we're running out of time, but, you know, Commissioner Bratton said these are going to be community policing police officers, which you and many of your colleagues have said this is how we're going to solve crime without stop and frisk. So if that's the case, make you a little happier?
Well, we'll see. The proof is in the pudding.
The final question I want to ask you, which is out there, and it's out there specifically today, NBC today cut ties with Donald Trump because of his comments. I noticed on your Facebook page you also were highly critical. Donald Trump is getting $230 million of tax breaks, not to mention that he's getting free water service from the city of New York. Should something be done? Should the borough of the Bronx cut ties? Should the city take a look at that contract? If NBC could do it to Donald Trump and say, you know what, we have morals that he has broken, should the Bronx, should the city of New York do something?
Well, I don't know if legally you can take some of these steps that NBC has done and other, Univision, for example. They have moral clauses in their contract, so they can do that. Whether the city can do that, whether it's part of a development that he's done, it makes it much more difficult and more complicated. But I think Donald Trump is a disgraceful human being who I wish that he would go away and never come back.
So you think there's nothing legally that could be done? The other real quick question is, if he's a presidential candidate, is it appropriate for him to be getting all these public tax breaks?
No, I don't believe that. Absolutely
Well,
not.
that's now an interesting question. All right, so now I'm doing something that I didn't tell you I was going to do.
Oh, look at that.
Okay, we got brand new cups. Some people could see the cups. And so we have like a half dozen of the old cups left. And I thought for people who have been regular guests on the show, who have been part of the show and enthusiastic and never say to me, no, I'm not coming on, I'll come on anytime you want, regardless of what the issues are, we're going to give this gift of one of only 6 left. And the beauty of it is, look at the old telephone.
Wow,
That's how old this show is. So Assemblyman Sepulveda, I just made it up. We have an honor roll, and now you're Bronx Talk honor roll, and you're one of the... So there's only a few left.
Look at
All
that.
right, so we also have some viewer mail to read, okay?
Sure.
So regarding last week's show about the Clinton Garden and DeWitt Clinton High School, a couple of very interesting messages we got on Facebook. The DeWitt C program is a wonderful addition to the traditional curriculum. It really should be offered in all schools, even if they have to garden in large pots. I guess that was somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Thank you to Anita C. via Facebook. And Ramon R. wrote on Facebook, great to see positive news about a great place. So we thank both of them for their comments, and I certainly agree about it being a great place since I am an alum. But if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at Bronxtalk@bronxnet.org, or you put them on our Facebook page and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. We ask you to like Bronx Talk on Facebook. The Assemblyman did it. And you can check out our archives at bronxnet.org. You find Bronx Talk on the lower right navigation bar. Thank you to our producer, Dahlia Gonzalez, our director, Shirley, and Helen is running the prompter. We got a cast of thousands, and to you, we'll be here next week. Good night.
From a young age, I definitely want to major in political science. After that, I'm going to get my law degree. Then I'm going to come back to Detroit, boost the economy, become the mayor or something, try to make the situation better for other people. I feel like I owe it to the city. I'm determined. It's going to happen. My name is Justin, and I am your dividend.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean.